And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening's presentation. And before I do, I want to thank Reverend Rhoda. Okay, you're going to introduce her. That's right. Okay. So Reverend Rhoda Brumfield is the pastor of this church, and we are very grateful to her and the elders and the members of this church who have made this possible. Thank you, Reverend Rhoda.
I just want to welcome you to Richwood Presbyterian Church. This May we celebrated our 180th anniversary, and we have, as the sign says, we have been worshiping on this spot continually since 1834. And when I come in here on Sunday morning, there's just a sense that this is really holy ground. And so we really get a chance to enjoy that each Sunday. I do want to invite you, we have these brochures. If you don't have one already, you can pick one up on the piano. It gives a little bit brief history, as well as a picture of the church from the 1880s, where you can see the benches where the ladies used to dismount from their horses in order to come into worship. So it's kind of a nostalgic piece as well, kind of tracing an overview of the history. And now, without any further speaking, I hate to give up my pulpit, but Ruth Brunings is, along with Ann Gullion, are the longest members still living of this church. And so welcome, and thank you, Ruth.
Well, welcome to this historic Richwood Church. I'm Ruth Wade Cox Brunings, a member of the Boone County Historical Society and also an elder in the Presbyterian Church. Richwood Church celebrates its 180th birthday. I celebrate my 80th birthday and 80 years of being part of this congregation. I was baptized on the first Sunday in May in 1934 as an infant. Both of my parents were members, and my ancestors, the Bedingers, were members of Richwood Church from the early 1840s. From the early times of the church, there have always been Bedingers and their descendants as members and as church leaders, ministers, elders, deacons, Sunday school superintendents, and teachers. Richwood Presbyterian Church was organized in 1834 and is the oldest Presbyterian church in Boone County. The Presbyterian Church in Maysville was organized in 1792 and is the oldest Presbyterian church in northern Kentucky. Just as our country had 13 original colonies, our church had 13 original members. Several descendants of this early congregation still worship in this historic church. The organizing minister was Reverend Joseph Cabell Harrison, who, together with Reverend John Breckenridge, established the first religious paper in Kentucky called the Western Bluebird in 1824. Reverend Harrison was a cousin to President William Henry Harrison. Reverend Harrison is buried up here in Richwood Cemetery, as well as 4 other Richwood church ministers. Reverend Harrison's wife was Sophia Rice, granddaughter of Reverend David Rice. The first pioneers came to Kentucky in the early 1770s. Daniel Boone built Fort Boonesborough in 1775, and at the request of these early settlers, Reverend David Rice established 4 Presbyterian churches in 1784 in Kentucky. Originally, all Presbyterian churches in Kentucky were organized under one presbytery. That was called Ebenezer. In 1935, Richwood Church was transferred to the Louisville Presbytery, and in 1983, Richwood Church was transferred once again to the Cincinnati Presbytery. The early Presbyterians opposed slavery, and as members of the first Constitutional Convention in Kentucky, they were in the minority as they voted for Kentucky to be a free state. They lost. David Rice stated, and I quote, "I believe that a curse attends slavery and that national vices will be punished with national calamity." The early Presbyterian Church voted that slavery was a sin, but they believed the way to end slavery was to change the hearts of men, so men would then change the law and end slavery. They saw the church's mission as evangelical, not social reform. Slaves were members of Richwood Church since 1843. In the 1850s and 1860s, the puritanical culture of the time was reflected in the recordings in the session books, which are the church records. Stern disciplinary action was taken by the elders, who are the church leaders, with members who failed to obey the Ten Commandments or to fulfill their obligation as members. These documented transgressions included absence from worship, intemperate drinking, frequenting places of public resort, adultery, insubordination conduct as a servant, use of profane language, and leading desolate or worldly lives. Offenders were suspended from church membership until they repented. The names and the sins of those suspended were announced from the pulpit. Now about the church buildings. Services were first held in homes and then in a schoolhouse. In 1841, a house for public worship was proposed. In 1842, a lot was purchased, and in 1843, it was recorded that session met in the new church and that a sexton was hired. The original church building was struck by lightning and burned in 1869. The building we worship in here today was built in 1870. A community house was built in the 1940s with a kitchen. Church activities such as wedding receptions, youth group meetings, potluck dinners took place in this building, as well as a Thanksgiving dinner for the entire neighborhood. In 1946, the current stone manse up on the hill was built by Stanley Ransom with help from other men of the church. The Sunday school annex was built onto the back of the church in 1960. Prior to this, Sunday school classes were held in the four corners of the sanctuary. And the kindergarten class was held in that little room in the back there, which is really a coat closet. In a small room in the church festival by Miss Lucy Bettinger, a descendant of Reverend David Rice. Lucy Bettinger was my first Sunday school teacher. Kenny Hughes Taylor taught grade school age children, and Nan Chambers Ransom taught the high school age children during my youth. All three were teachers by profession and outstanding Sunday school teachers. We were rewarded pins for perfect attendance. This is what I would see. Perfect Sunday school attendance. The fellowship hall with offices and additional classrooms was added onto the church to replace the community house in 1991. Now, the stone wall was built in 1930 with stones from the creek directly across the road. Dr. J.M. Huey, who is in his late 90s, soon to be 100, and he would hope to be here tonight, but I don't think he made it. Dr. J.M. Huey and David Houston, his teenage boys, helped the stonemasons by bringing the stone over from the creek. David Houston is the father of Patsy and Joanne, who are members of the church today. This little white frame country church, situated in a beautiful rural setting, surrounded by a stone wall, maple trees, opposite a creek, has been the subject of many artists and photographers, including Carolyn Williams and George Rock. Carolyn Williams did the ink sketch here.
The sketch is on this side.
Over here. And the watercolor by George Roth, who is a well-known historic architect, is on the easel. And recently, this year, a group of artists from Cincinnati called Plein Air came out and set up their easels across the road and did the church, and that's the picture here that we look at. This one. Those are some of the more famous examples of artistic work that has captured the beauty of our church. In 1971, a historical marker was awarded to Richwood Presbyterian Church by the Kentucky Historical Society and placed at the entrance of the church. You may have seen it on your way in. Placed there at the stone wall which surrounds the church and the cemetery. At this time, an application was made to list Richwood Church with the National Registry of Historic Places based on history and culture. This application was denied. A new application is now being submitted based on architecture with the help of the Kentucky Heritage Council. I meet with them next week. The cemetery. Richwood Cemetery separated from Richwood Church in 1930, and immediately thereafter the stone wall was built. Prior to that time, persons buried in Richwood Cemetery were members of the church or relatives of members of the church. In 1930, we became a community cemetery, not a church cemetery. The first burial was George Michael Bettinger, Jr., who died in 1833 of cholera and big bone during the cholera epidemic. In 1880, the cemetery acquired an additional acre and was extended on this side over to Richwood Road. It's now designated Division C. There are no slaves buried in Richwood Cemetery. The slaves who were members of Richwood Church had fled or moved away after the Civil War. The first burial of an African American was in Division C in 1933. Her name was Mary Sleep Seagrass, a member of the local Sleep family. An area near the stone wall by the entrance, right over here, was designated a potter's field for the burial of persons too poor to buy a burial space. And the area here on the east by the church was designated as a children's cemetery for children. Among the long list of dedicated beloved ministers are the following who served the longest terms. Reverend J. Russell Paul served 2 5-year terms and was active in community organizations, including the Boy Scouts. Judge Bruce Ferguson was a member of that Boy Scout troop, and he has fond memories of Reverend Cross and the Boy Scouts. Reverend Jean Hyde Faber was the first female minister, and she served for 9 years. Reverend Everett Wade Bettinger was the longest-serving minister in church history, 11 years, both before and after the Civil War. 2 of his sons became Presbyterian ministers, 2 of his daughters married Presbyterian ministers, 1 nephew and 1 grandson also became Presbyterian ministers. 1 son, 2 daughters, 1 grandson, and 1 niece became foreign missionaries. Reverend Bettinger, his second wife, and many of his 14 children and their descendants are buried here in the cemetery. As a small church, Richwood Church was not always able to support a full-time minister. Some early ministers were employed on a part-time basis and served other churches as well. Some had other sources of income, such as farming or other employment, such as teaching. Reverend Samuel Lynn had a school and boarded children during the week. Reverend William White also had a private school at Whitehaven on US 42 up the road from the current public school at New Haven. Reverend White had boarding accommodations for both boys and girls. There were periods when the pulpit was filled with stated supply from presbytery, seminary students, guest ministers, or Richwood Church elders. In order to support a part-time pastor, my grandmother, Agnes Roberts, provided room and board for Reverend Cross during his first term as minister and the manse was rented with the income used for church expenses. Richwood Church was founded by a domestic missionary of the Presbyterian Church, Reverend Harrison, and has a long and sustained commitment to missionary work both at home and overseas. As early as 1843, there is documentation in the church records that the minister was requested to preach on the subject of mission, and a special collection was taken to be sent to the Board of Domestic Missions. Reverend Charles Foreman, a missionary to India, and under the care of the Ebenezer Presbytery in Kentucky, was invited to preach, and special collections for his support were taken in 1848. Two descendants of Reverend Foreman, his daughters Emily and Mary Foreman, were also missionaries to India. The son of Reverend William White, Reverend William White Jr., was a missionary to China. There's documentation in the church records of a special collection being taken for domestic and foreign missions on the first Sabbath in August in 1861. Reverend Everett Wade Bettinger, who I mentioned before, had two sons, two son-in-laws, three daughters, one grandson, and a niece who were foreign missionaries to the following countries: Brazil, Mexico, Korea, the Belgian Congo, and Africa. Both Reverend Bettinger and his grandson, Reverend Robert Bettinger, served as home missionaries to Alabama, Mississippi, and North Carolina. Reverend Bettinger's daughter, Anna Bettinger, contracted the disease flu in Korea and had to return home after many years due to ill health. His niece, Jessie Bettinger, my grandmother's sister, contracted tuberculosis in Mexico, where she was a missionary, returned to Phoenix, Arizona, where she died at the age of 47. Both Anna and Jessie are buried in Richwood Cemetery. Some of these Richwood missionaries were self-supporting, and some were supported by the Presbyterian Board of Missions. Richwood Church had an early missionary society organized by the women of the church to help support foreign missionaries. The commitment to mission extended to the local community. Revivals called protracted meetings were held, and new converts were brought into church membership. New converts included slaves in the Richwood community. The first slave to join Richwood Church was Moses Carter on January 5, 1843, followed by Rachel, Drusilla, Plato, Hannah Harrison, and Hannah Hughes, and Margaret Garner. In 1855, there were 26 white members and 7 slave members. Slaves were seen as equal before God. Plato was hired as the church sexton in 1844 on completion of the new church building and continued in this paid employment until December 1856 when he moved to Covington with his owner, William Mendes. Margaret Garner joined Richwood Church in 1856. Her mother, Drusilla, was also a member. They lived at Maplewood, the farm right next to the church in the west. Their owners, the Gaines family, were members of the Episcopal Church in Covington. Margaret fled slavery with her husband, their 4 children, and his parents in January of 1856, less than a year after she joined the church. Upon capture, the next day at her cousin's home in Cincinnati, Margaret killed one of her daughters and attempted to kill her other children, rather than allow them to be returned to slavery. After a lengthy trial, the slaves were remanded back to their owners under the Fugitive Slave Law. The federal case for the return of fugitive slaves took precedence over the state case for the capital crime of murder of a child. Before Margaret was requisitioned to be returned to Ohio to stand trial for murder, the Garner family was sold down the river to a plantation in Mississippi where Margaret died of typhoid fever several years later. The trial received national attention at the time and has been the subject of fiction since. The novel Beloved by Toni Morrison The movie Beloved, produced by Oprah Winfrey, and the opera Margaret Garner are works of fiction based on the life of Margaret Garner. Many visitors come to Richwood Church to visit the Margaret Garner site and to hear her story. As a member at Richwood Church during puritanical times, Margaret would have known the Ten Commandments and church discipline for transgressors, as well as criminal justice for murder. The impact of this event on Richwood Church and the Richwood community was profound. Everett Wade Bettinger was an elder, clerk of session, an opponent of slavery, and in the absence of a minister was the preacher. He recorded in the church records on June 1st, 1856, that session met and ordered a day of fasting. Members were instructed, and I quote, to repair to the house of God for solemn worship, confession of sin, and deep humiliation before God on account of our sins and departure from Him as a congregation and as an individual member. For the return of God's Spirit to enable the conversion of others. This same language was used by Governor Winslow following violence on the part of the Indians toward the Plymouth colony as a day of fasting and humiliation. And to quote Governor Winslow's words, humiliation before the Lord for all those sins whereby we have provoked our good God sadly to interrupt our peace and comfort. As individual church members had committed a sin, including Margaret for the murder of her child, and the congregation had failed in the conversion of new members, including Margaret, who had sinned, the church leaders were also the community leaders. This was a time for deep reflection about slavery and for positive change in interracial relations, which has continued onward from that time. African Americans had lived in the Richwood community first as slaves, then as tenant farmers, later as farm owners, neighbors, and family friends, and had worshiped at Richwood Church throughout the history of our church. There were three events which contributed to the anti-slavery sentiment prior to the Civil War. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published. In 1856, Margaret Garner, her trial took place. In 1859, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry occurred. Two of these events occurred in Cincinnati, and all three, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Margaret Garner, and John Brown, were Presbyterians. We've had major celebrations with dinners and festivities which have occurred every 50 years as Richwood Church had its 50th, 100th, and 150th birthdays. This year, on the first Sabbath in May of 2014, Richwood Church celebrated its 180th birthday. Another event, on January 17, 1971, the historical marker out in front of the church was dedicated during a ceremony which included speeches, music, and a reception. In conclusion, Richwood Church has been blessed with a beautiful house of worship, a peaceful setting, spiritual and intellectual leadership, inspiring music, caring congregations, and the grace of God. Its history is interwoven with the history of our country, and it's been the source of strength and comfort during troubled times, slavery, wars, depressions. During the rural area, it was the center of the social life as well as the center of religious life in the community. The presence of God and the memories of our ancestors continue to abide in this historic church. Now, if there's anything anybody wants to add in addition to my remarks, or ask any questions, you can do so. And I'll turn it over to Sally.
We would like to invite you to come into our multi-purpose room and have some punch and cookies. And I hope you've enjoyed being here. I'd just like to comment, one of the things that I got such a big kick out of when I belonged to this church since 2004. If you'll notice, and it is a cupboard, there's a little room right next there, and it's not very big at all, and even the paper on the wall is not the original, but they tried to get it to look like the original, and it's just a closet where we put the little outfits for the little kids that light up candles on Sunday morning, but I get such a big kick out of that. And the other thing was I had never seen an offering being taken in these wooden things with the velvet thing. And every Sunday, I'm just thrilled when I see these go, but they're something simple, but such history behind it too, but I haven't mentioned those two things first. But we enjoyed having you here, and please join us. Thank you.